All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am super excited to have as my guest today, Christine Cissy White. Cissy, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
All right. So Cissy is a trauma mama, writer, and joy-stalking survivor. She believes it's possible but difficult to live, love, and parent well while post-traumatically stressed. Her goal is to make talk about trauma and healing less clinical and more conversational, less abstract and more accessible. She's currently working at the ACEs Connection as a Northeast community facilitator and parenting with ACEs community manager. She believes the trauma-informed movement must be survivor-led. Cissy, welcome.
Thank you.
All right. So I don't know where I found out about you, but I'll tell you one thing, you have like this energy about you. Even online, you have this energy about you that is very powerful. It's very positive. I think it even comes through in your smile. You have this like very infectious smile. Anyway, so I wanted to, even in your bio says it, you know, you're someone that I really want to have on this podcast, and what I love about doing this podcast. So anyway, welcome.
Thank you so much.
All right. So before we start here, share with our listeners where you're from and where you're calling from, and then let's do it.
Yeah, I'm from Massachusetts, a lifelong resident. So I'm in Greater Boston on the South Shore.
Nice.
Now I get to travel a lot in the Northeast, but have always been from Massachusetts.
Okay, awesome. So let's start out with a quote, because I know you have one. What do you have for us?
All right. So I actually had so many to choose from because I've been a quote collector since I was 11. So I have a collection, but the ones I thought were most appropriate for PTSD that spoke to me the most, the first one was Robin Morgan, "To admit suffering is to begin the creation of freedom." And that one for me, at least early in trauma recovery, like reframed how I thought of pain as a doorway, you know, to something, to freedom, as opposed to something to avoid. But it was really counterintuitive to me. That's why I like that quote, because I was really like, I do not understand what that means. And I don't even understand how somebody can believe that. But in feminism, I got it. I understood in feminism, like, we have to start saying what's hard in order to make changes. It took much longer to get that when it came to trauma, that there was some benefit in admitting the things that were hard in order to make changes. So that one was the one I wanted to go with, just because the other one that I really liked and also read all the time and had hanging up when I was early in the early days, like 3 decades ago, of PTSD, when I was first diagnosed, was, "If we don't suffer who we are, others suffer for us." And that one for me always made me return to why I'm healing. Like at the beginning of healing, it never occurred to me that I would ever be happy, which, yay, I got to that, but that was not the goal. It was just not to be destructive. That was it.
Right.
Because I was like, I might not be able to be happy, but I can definitely not make other people miserable.
Right.
I definitely thought that was possible. And that for me was now I'd say with self-love, I would have done it for myself as well. Wouldn't have been there at all. And that would not have resonated for me early in healing. I just was like, just don't be a succubus on the planet.
Right.
Like, you may not be able to be a contributor, but don't be that. And that was the way I thought back then. So I just wanted to share those too, because I think what we think and feel when we're healed is really different than when we're in agony.
Well, yeah, I mean, I love both those quotes, and I think if we kind of invite you to tell your story, we'll kind of, those will be unpacked along the way. So I'm really curious, because I don't know that much about your story, and I really am curious to hear how the hell you got here. What do you?
Okay. It's funny because it's fairly recent. I mean, my personal journey is long, of course. I'm in my 50s, but my professionally talking publicly about being a survivor is really since 2014. And I've always been a writer, so I wrote and researched and was interested in healing and people's personal stories of all kinds, just biography and memoir kind of stories. But what happened was in 2014, I went to the trauma conference in Boston, the International Trauma Conference. Now, I had never been to a professional conference in my life. I'm the first person in my family to go to college. I was a mom at the time and a single mom. So it was like a huge deal for me to even figure that all out, to go to a conference for 4 days. And it was paying out of pocket because I wasn't working. So it was like $500. And I remember I was astounded that there were no survivors. Like it was a conference for trauma survivors, and it was the billed as the 25th anniversary of developmental trauma. And it was Bessel van der Kolk, and it was all these amazing people that I had been researching, like a trauma survivor groupie. I mean, I knew all the names, I read all the books, I had been following all the research, but I just didn't know anything about the clinical world at all. So I just went as a survivor, which not one person spoke as a survivor. There was not one book by a survivor. There was not one vending. There was zero survivor voice. And I was shocked. I was like, I literally went home and did artwork about like Let the Rats Speak, because they were doing all these talking about all these studies about rats and mice. I mean, fascinating, really interesting studies, and monkeys and all this stuff. And I was like, but people have PTSD and we can share, like we can give feedback. Like it doesn't have to be so abstract. Like why aren't there panels with survivors talking to therapists? Because I should say that the topic of this particular conference was 25 years, where have we come? And I had been diagnosed with PTSD 25 years before.
Oh, wow.
So I was like, I've lived the like feel it to heal it, all talk all the time, to change into like, no, we all just have to be in the body and not too much talk. Like I've seen this the pendulum, but from the patient side. And I was like, this is not included or represented at all. Like, I mean, and now I know that a lot of therapists are trauma survivors, which I didn't know at the time. So I was astounded, and literally was just like, we can change this. Like we have to change this. We need to be talking to each other. Obviously we can't be talking to our own therapists in a, like, I understand the personal professional boundary, but I'm like, we could be speaking clinically as peers and parents, and like, oh, you meant to be doing that with the therapy, but when I came home and actually had to parent, here's how it worked. And I was like, where are those conversations happening, so we can see how applicable it is, or what works and doesn't. And so that's what actually made me start writing publicly as a survivor, because and then some therapists reached out to me and said, we can't have those conversations with people. Like, it's unprofessional. If we can't talk to our patients and ask our patients to come present at the conferences, like it's an awkward balance. We don't necessarily know how to deal with that paradox. And I was like, well, survivors can just start talking.
Well, but also, first of all, I mean, I think what you did was awesome. And I think your actions are completely validated. I mean, yes, a lot of therapists are trauma survivors, but that doesn't preclude another discussion, a simultaneous discussion with survivors and as survivors. And number one. Number two, yes, the therapists can't invite their clients, but that doesn't mean that other survivors can't just go and another therapist can talk to them and have that discussion. I want to kind of drill into that and dial into that, but if we may, Cissy, can we go back a little bit? And you said, by that time you had experienced, or you were living with PTSD, you had been diagnosed 25 years ago. I mean, with sensitivity here and boundaries, of course, but what was that experience like for you? I mean, as a survivor, how did you come to terms with that?
Being diagnosed?
Well, yes, even getting to the point where you're like, something's going on, or I knew something going on, that whole process.
Yeah, I was in college when I got diagnosed. I sought therapy in college. And again, I was the first person in my family to go. So college was a culture shock. And when I was in college, my grandmother had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer and died. My stepfather, and my family, which of origin, which had been abusive, he also died. And then in the same 18-month period, my sister met our biological father, who had abandoned us when we were, when I was a baby and she was a toddler. And it all happened in this really short, compressed amount of time, and I was in college. And so I started getting anxiety attacks, which I had never had, and just absolutely terrified me. Thought I was, thought I was having a heart attack. I didn't know what anxiety was. And so I had seen the movie Born on the 4th of July way back when with Tom Cruise, and I was sitting in the front seat, and I was with a bunch of friends from college, and we went back home after the movie, and we were doing like a stress test, and I remember my score was off the charts, and I remember writing in my journal before bed, like, for someone with so much stress, I'm doing really well. And I woke up the next day and had like a full-blown anxiety attack, and went to health services and was like, I did not understand what was going on. And then they started asking a little bit about my family history and past, and that was kind of where everything came out. And it was at that time in college, I probably went to therapy twice a week for the rest of college. And that was when I got the diagnosis of PTSD and started realizing my family life wasn't like everybody else's. My mom was 16 when she had kids. Her partner was abusive. My stepfather was an alcoholic. So there was physical violence. And this is partly why I am in the ACEs movement now, is because there was lots of different types of trauma. And even back then, therapy really focused on like if there had been sexual abuse or not, and not the intersection of poverty,
right,
being working class, sexism, interpersonal violence, all the different, and all those are they all intersect in ways that are really important. So that was so much all at once. And then I was in college, and I was also like an amazing and exciting time. Like the world was opening up, and I was learning about books and research and all these fascinating things. So it was just a big time in my life. And that diagnosis, I was furious when I was diagnosed, because I had gone to therapy for 3 months before I was diagnosed, and kind of understood that the diagnosis and the trauma was related to abuse. And I didn't understand, and this relates to my activism, why I was the one who had to get the diagnosis. So I remember when I was filling out the forms, and the therapist was saying, you can get insurance coverage for this, because I was too afraid to tell anyone at home I was going to therapy. I had to fill out a diagnosis, and she's like, you can put generalized anxiety disorder if you want. You'd qualify, that would be covered. And I just listed the names of the people that abused me. And she's like, you can't do that. And I was like, I don't understand why I have to get the diagnosis. I completely rejected it. I was like, that doesn't make sense. She's like, well, you can put generalized anxiety disorder. And I was like, but it's not general. It's not generalized at all. It's really specific.
right.
And so she said, well, you can put post-traumatic stress. And I was like, well, that's more accurate. That's more accurate. Like, but if we only treat me and not the cause, I was like, it doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand why the person getting help is getting a diagnosis. Like, that will hurt me and it won't help the cause. So I had a really hard time fundamentally with that concept of being diagnosed. It was a real struggle, like just that idea. And is partly why I'm also interested in social change, because I think if we just treat symptoms without treating causes, I don't know, like, where are we going to get?
Right. So you got the diagnosis while you were in college?
Yep.
Okay. And, from that point until you went to that, that conference was many years, right?
Yes. 25.
Okay. Wow. So what, obviously we can't cover everything here, but I'm curious what led you to that conference.
Two things. I would say, one, feminism, just understanding that the personal is political, and that who tells stories, who has access to information, who writes narratives, is often a cultural thing, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily who has the most information or knowledge. It's like that is sometimes just who has access. And so I wanted access, and I definitely felt like I could get access. There was no reason to not try to get access directly from the biggest experts I could possibly get, so that I could, kind of like somebody that's like, I want to have a church experience, a religious experience that's personal. Like, I wanted to figure out for myself, how did I interpret what the experts were saying, instead
Right.
of going through somebody else who's interpreting what the experts were saying. So that was one piece of it. The second piece of it was, and this has informed all my work, as being an adoptive mother, because the adoption community has really led the way that I think of both advocacy and therapy, in terms of adoptees reframed what adoptees needed, and then let the therapeutic community know where they got it right and wrong. And adoptive families ended up supporting adoptees in that work, and created quite a movement that shifted and made changes in laws about whether we disclose or not who adoptive families are, laws about people's access to their stories and identities even when they're hard, challenged basic notions about if people just forget, it won't impact them, or if they don't know
Mm-hmm.
certain things, it's better. It challenged fundamental ideas about what it means to be family or have a story or an identity. And adoptive families really understood, before I think the general public community, how impactful trauma was, because they had kids who often had trauma, either poverty, abuse,
Right.
neglect, and understood that even when that trauma was only 1, 2, or 3 years, it didn't have to be a whole childhood. It would have significant impacts on how kids engaged in school, how they
Yeah.
bonded, the kind of it. And so when I became an adoptive parent and learned about attachment style parenting, I learned that there was this enormous network of adoptive parents who were educating each other. And then they would
Mm.
arm each other with information, like when you go to your pediatrician and your pediatrician doesn't understand co-sleeping because they don't understand attachment, and tells you to let your kid cry it out. If they have a trauma history, like, you have to ignore all that and do this, and then educate them.
Right.
And it
Right.
was such a different model. Or like, if you go to your school and your school says, your kid needs this, but you end up as a parent who has a kid with a disability of any kind, you need to let them know, actually, like, here's what might help. And
Right.
they were the ones who helped bring trauma sensitive schools and into being, because they knew it was actually the Attachment Trauma Network folks, who were both adoptive parents, who both had been educators, who understood that even though I'm an educator, once they had a child that had attachment issues themselves,
Right.
things they thought weren't the things they thought worked weren't the things that actually worked with their kids.
Right.
And they realized, oh, we have to learn something else. So this
Wow.
educator partnership ended up transforming this movement, and has been leading the trauma sensitive schools movement, which is really strong now, and informs many of us now in the trauma community, because we're like, oh, communities can do things,
Right.
schools can do things, families can do things, and of course therapists can do things, but we all have our place.
So you walked out of that conference. What happened? What did you leave there with?
I started writing publicly. I mean, almost within 2 months, I wrote a piece about that experience, about becoming the person you needed, and like, where are the survivors? Why are there so many survivors and so much silence? Why doesn't anybody poll us or ask us what we need, or if the help helps?
Right.
Why aren't we in collaboration and communication? And so
And
I started just blogging on my post. Like, Heal Right Now, I started writing for Elephant Journal, a little bit for the Boston Globe, Spirituality and Health, and just started asking like ethical questions about, why aren't we allies? And
right. And what did you find out? What were you hearing back?
it was really a professional, I mean, I think we still have it today. And when we talk about ACEs and trauma, there's a very professional, personal divide between when we show up as a professional versus when we show up as a survivor. And many of us are both or many things, but it's vulnerable if we lead as a survivor.
Yeah, you're bringing up a lot here that I'm tempted to go down, but I'm really kind of intrigued and inspired by your passion of advocacy and so forth. So you started writing in these different platforms, and you're talking about this kind of hard line on this distinction, and I love that word you use about vulnerability. It's to present or to show up as both, right? Because like you said, so many individuals so many therapists, counselors, whatever, who are in this field, specialization of trauma, have experienced trauma, um, but are survivors being heard now at that level?
I think it's improving a lot. I think there's more to go, but I think it's improving. And in fact, it was interesting because I wrote this piece for Elephant Journal, and it was how can anyone love me with all my issues? And it was read by like 250,000 people. And I was not a big blogger at the
Wow.
time. It was huge. And I realized, and the comments that people wrote, and it was about trauma, but I didn't use trauma in the title.
Mm.
So many people, and it was about how I was looking for a role model, but I wasn't willing to be public. I wanted other people. I was looking for a survivor who was professional, had a decent family life, had a decent sex life, seemingly had a decent financial life, like seemed like they had an okay enough life to be public and say, here's how I got here. It's been hard. Here's what worked. Here's what didn't. And then I was like, I'm not willing to do that. That's what I was writing about. That's when I finally was like, I'm waiting for something I'm not even willing to do. I'm
Wow.
looking for it.
Right.
Then I was like, after that, it was like, I just totally went there. And luckily for me, which because I had been a writer and believed in the power of telling story, and thankfully had many years of experience disclosing personally, because it could have been really bad, but I had experience at that. So I knew I had felt and mostly had a good experience. And so I started writing about how hard it was to be a survivor, and not like hard, like poor me, but just like, why didn't anyone tell me how hard it would be when I had kids? Why didn't anyone tell me how hard it would be to co-sleep? Like, that's so different as a survivor. Or like, how come no one said love would be like the hardest thing I would ever have to figure out? Like, that would be the tricky one. Like, and then so many people would write and comment and say, thank you for saying that. Like, no one's ever said that. That's my experience. And it was like the harder I said it was, the more people said thank you.
Wow.
The more I said, like, I didn't understand this. And I remember I wrote one piece about how paying attention was the hardest part of parenting for me, because to get through childhood, I checked out. I didn't listen to my body. I didn't pay attention to my body. I zoned out. Like, it was super adaptive. But then when you're a mother, you're like, safety. You're responding to your kids' wants, needs, thoughts, feelings. And I was like, it was like a part of my brain that I had never used. And I just remember being like, this is so hard to not check out.
Right.
How come no one talks about this? Like,
right.
Do other people find this easy? Like, I don't like paying this much attention. I want to go daydream. I want to go.
Right.
Like, it actually hurts.
Right. Right. Just quickly, what's coming up for me is I don't know, that resonated with me about, the harder you said it was, the more people like started speaking up. And it's so easy, I think, for us to, talk to people and everyone, you're like, oh, how's it going? Oh, it's going great. But when people are like honest and open about how tough it can be, and especially when like yourself moving through this world as someone who's experienced trauma, and like you said, what you had to do when you were a young kid was very adaptive, but that's certainly not going to fly when you're a parent. When someone else is speaking the truth, you're like, yes, finally, thank God you're saying it, and you're resonating with me. That is like, okay, finally, this is my people, you know?
Exactly, it's oxygen. And I think
Right.
we tend to think if we talk about how hard it is, we're going to like scare survivors or we're going to intimidate survivors. But I think survivors just, if if we've known it's hard and somebody's like, it's like if you have vertigo and you don't know what vertigo is, even if the doctor can't make your vertigo go away, but they can be like, that's vertigo. You're
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, all right. Other people have had this, like, oh, okay, so they've had it too. Like, it's a little easier. It
Yeah.
doesn't make the symptoms any easier, but you have a construct, and you're like, oh, phew, it's not just me that thinks it's hard. I'm not the only one that's dizzy. I'm not the only one that's, whatever. And there's a lot of power in that, and I think we feel like we have to do something so much, and if we give people the ability to be like in writing groups, sometimes I give a prompt, the hardest thing about trauma is ... and just let people finish the sentence. Like, we don't have to cure it, we don't have to fix it, we're just
Mm-hmm.
sharing what's hard, and that in and of itself will lighten us. Just that,
Mm-hmm.
if that's all we do, and give ourselves permission to say, oh, this is heavy, we can lighten our own load too, like in our journal, by doing that. And I feel like sometimes we try to perk ourselves up so much in that warring energy that's like, there's a difference between gratitude and allowing. And it was really hard for me as a survivor to understand self-care, because it felt like I I had to fully be allowed to feel as awful as I did in order to find places where I could feel better. But it felt like in the beginning, everyone's rushing in to try to make me feel better. And it
Mm-hmm.
felt like I was letting them down, because I'm like, it just feels bad.
Right,
It
right.
just feels bad. And then when I could finally say that, and other people are like, yeah, it feels bad. Like, and
I
it's,
think, your voice is so needed in this field. As you're talking, Sissy, I'm thinking to myself, where do you fit in a sense within the uh, dynamic of therapists and survivors and conferences and so forth, and as someone who talks to a lot of people in this field, I'm listening to you and I'm thinking the way you're speaking is almost existing in between what a lot of therapists and the way a lot of therapists are speaking, what they're saying, and what survivors are saying. It's almost like the bridge in a sense.
yeah. And that's funny, because I do feel like I do actually feel like a translator.
Yeah.
And I often feel like sometimes I'm trying to tell survivors, like, I think this is what survivors, what therapists mean. Like, or this is what the professionals are trying to do. It can feel
Mm.
alienating or something, but like, here's what I think is happening. And vice versa. I can feel like when I'm talking to professionals, sometimes I'm like, here's what we're saying, kind of like when you're not in the room. Like, it's hard to be honest with our therapists about questions about the ethics of uh, the power dynamic or something. You
Mm-hmm,
know what I mean? Like,
mm-hmm.
you don't want to have those. We can talk to each other, and many of us, but we're not talking kind of like as groups to each other. And I think there's a lot that survivors miss on what is beneficial about therapy. And I think there's a lot of things that therapists don't understand of why survivors don't always access more from it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we could all benefit.
Let me just remind everyone that I'm speaking with Christine Cissy White. Her website is called Heal Right Now. That's Heal Right is spelled WRITE right now. I'll have her site linked up at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. So, what would you say your mission is?
Um, I mean, I would say it's I care what the theories about trauma are, but I'm more interested in sharing and understanding how trauma feels. So to people as we're experiencing it in our day-to-day lives, as just part of our story. So I guess on the one hand, it's like a two-part mission. I was like, I want to be really specific about the internal experience of being a trauma survivor, which is very changeable and is very different, but also connecting, breaking down the personal and professional, because we all have a story and we're all sharing each other. We're sharing a bigger story together. So I feel like they're opposite. There's like this big global universal thing I'm trying to do. Like we're all just have a story. It's not just about trauma. But on the other hand, here's how trauma can feel, or here's how love can feel if you're a trauma survivor. Here's how parenting can feel if you're a trauma survivor. Here's how the medical community can feel if you're a trauma survivor. So that it's both really specific and really general. So it's kind of spiritual, and it's kind of like I feel like it is kind of spiritual and kind of like a writer. So it is like, so we don't feel alone. I don't think we're alone. And I think if we go deep enough, we are all, there's a lot of commonality. Right. But I think we talk sometimes in ways that distances us instead of brings us together. So I guess my goal is trying to break that down. And I have as much to learn as anybody. I have my own blind spots and area. I have my own weaknesses and so it's definitely been a long journey, not to be like us and them. Because I used to have a very idea of like, I don't know, it's just like almost an adversarial relationship, like survivors or professionals. Right. And I feel like it's way more complicated than that. And there's like roles we can get in that divide us.
So how do you get your word out? I mean, looking at your site right now, you do speaking, you're writing, what?
And I also work at Cissys Connection. And I think to me, the reason I work there and I love it is that website was started by a survivor who was a journalist and who wanted to bring together, she was a science writer, and wanted to bring together professionals and survivors and community activists in one place, sharing. Everyone has, on that network on Cissys Connection, which I love, is everybody's allowed to share. So people can share whether it's Dr. Folletti as the co-principal of the ACEs study, or it's a grad student who just learned about it yesterday. And people are cross-connecting in a social network that's entirely about ACEs. So I feel like that's the other place where it's like the adoption community. We've broken down a little bit. The topic is the thing that drives us and not our role.
Got it.
And that allows us all to be saying, okay, how do adverse childhood experiences affect, if I'm a police officer, what does that mean for like me and how I do my job, but also me in being a police officer? If I'm in an academic setting, how does it affect me as a professor, but also the students I'm seeing? So we can be in multiple roles and in conversations with people and breaking that role down a little bit. And that I really do think that's where survivors and the wider professional community are starting to talk and engage, because we're seeing it also has to exist in community and family. Whatever we do to heal, if we can't do it in our family life and in our personal life and in our community spaces, it's not going to last.
Yeah. Well, all right. Let's wind down here. I'm just realizing that I've got to have you back because there's a lot to talk about, and I'd love to have your voice continue on this podcast.
Thank you.
So let's get some go-to book recommendations from you. What do you have for us?
Okay, I have There's Nothing Wrong with You, No Matter What You Think by Sherry Huber. I would say this is really good for survivors, but it's also good for therapists to understand why you might have a client that doesn't have any idea what you're talking about when you say self-love. because it's about ending self-hate. And I think for a lot of people, survivors who have developmental trauma, self-love is too far a bridge. It's too high a mountain to climb. So first, just ending self-hate.
Okay.
And starting with that. And also it's really, it as a survivor, there's a line in there that says, how you treat other people is about who you are. How you treat yourself tends to reflect how you were parented. And that changed my life. Just that concept, and that was in this book.
Okay.
Okay. There's some work there.
Yeah.
So that one I would say is really good for survivors and to understand a survivor if you feel like you're just not getting a survivor you're working with. And then the other one that was most helpful for me, even though I know Bessel van der Kolk's book is brilliant and I love it, Invisible Hero, it was Bella Ruth Napperstack wrote, and it was more accessible to me because she wrote as a therapist who was struggling with reaching her clients. What she was doing as treatment wasn't working. So she started looking at guided imagery and different techniques. And it's a little bit about her story, but also, for me at least, it was a gentle introduction into guided imagery, meditation, all those things, which at least to me at the time, because I wasn't very in touch with my body, seemed really far out, but it was very safe and warmly and nicely done, and not too academic, which for me resonated. So it's still one of the books I turn to when I still use guided imagery when life throws me a curve. So those are the two I'd say are the best. Okay.
There's Nothing Wrong with You, No Matter What You Think, and Invisible Heroes, both of which I'll have linked up here at the show notes page at the FromThePodcast.com. Cissy, thank you so much for coming on here, and just it's an honor to speak with you. I mean, it's an honor to get to speak with you, and I can't wait, literally, really, seriously, to have you back.
I can't wait to be back. And I told you, you're like the David Letterman for us trauma nerds, and I'm so thrilled to be here, and I would love to continue the conversation because honestly, this is my passion. These conversations.
Well, it shows. Thank you so much. All right, take care.
Bye.